Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. Doug Maurice, Nathan Baird. We're talking about Ryan Day. And Nathan, sometimes you have to ask a question that can sound inflammatory because the answer might be no. But if you don't ask the question, you'll never find out. So we have a survey, we have a discussion that is around the idea of the level of faith that Ohio State fans have in Ryan Day. And this to me, again, slice it thin. This is not a discussion of, is Ryan Day on the hot seat? This is not a discussion of how long is Ryan Day going to be the head coach at Ohio State. I did rants like 2 weeks ago on if he would leave for the NFL after this year, who the next head coach would be. This to me is just like right now, how Ohio State fans feel about Ryan Day right now. Is he getting better as a head coach? Is he changing as a head coach? He's entering year 5. How important this season is. And I do feel like at a time, Nathan, when Ryan Day is is thinking about giving up play calling to Brian Hartline, when he's coming off 2 consecutive losses to Michigan, I do feel this could be a transitional year in Ryan Day's coaching life. Do you think that idea is possible?
I do. I think it is a significant year for him for any number of reasons. And I already think, though, that we'll discuss this, but some of the transition has already happened. And I'm curious to hear what you sent out a survey. We're going to have some results, and we have some comments from our Buckeye Talk texters. And what did they say relative to how they felt about Ryan Day on Thanksgiving weekend and how they felt about Ryan Day on New Year's Day? Because I think we've already seen some growth, and he's been talking about that.
So there's a question that a texter asked a while ago that prompted this, but let me do one of the survey questions first, Nathan, before we dive into that idea. And it's this, because I do think this is where everything starts. As you look back on the hiring of Ryan Day with 2020 hindsight, what do you think of the move? It was definitely the wrong move. Should have hired somebody with experience from the outside. It was definitely the right move. Promoting Day was smart. It could have gone either way, but I'll lean toward hiring Day. It could have gone either way, but I'll lean toward going outside, right? So it's the two ends in the middle. What do you think won? Definitely Day, definitely not Day, lean away from Day.
I think Lean Day won.
Definitely Ryan Day won overwhelmingly. And we are not saying this is every single Ohio State fan. We didn't get quite as many responses to this survey as we do get to some, but 68% said definitely the right move, promoting Ryan Day. 29% leaned toward Day, 3% leaned away from Day, and only one respondent in the whole thing said definitely wrong. So more than 2/3 definitely right. The conversation starts here, Nathan, because Ohio State and Gene Smith hired someone who had never done this before. And I do feel like in some of the recent discussions we've been having about Ryan Day, and one of the texters mentioned this, like we've kind of been building up to something like this. We've had a lot of discussions about evolution, about the state of the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry, and of course, Ryan Day's role in that, about his standing. And you do have to reference the fact, Nathan, that he'd never done this before, that there's a little bit of a learning curve here. I think that is a reasonable discussion around the guy who's never done this before. I also think it's a reasonable discussion. Should Ohio State have put itself in that position? So now we're in year 5 with all the things that Ryan Day has done. Good, big wins, big losses, huge games, opportunities, issues. And that's the kind of thing that Urban Meyer learned about at Bowling Green in Utah. It's the kind of thing that Earl Bruce learned about at Tampa and Iowa State. It's the kind of thing that John Cooper learned about at Tulsa and Arizona State. It's the kind of thing that Jim Tressel learned about in almost 2 decades at Youngstown State. And I think that is a reasonable question. And that's not a Ryan Day question, Nathan. That's an Ohio State decision question. So I do think it's one of these things. It's Ohio State. He has a learning curve. It doesn't mean you grade on a curve. You're Ohio State. But the idea of, man, they just, I don't want to say put this guy in a bad spot, but they hired a guy and put a lot on him who had never done this before. Let's start there. And maybe that was wrong. Maybe that was too much to ask. Maybe that was unfair. Maybe that wasn't the right thing for the program. And we got 2/3 slam. Nope. Right move. I don't know. That's reinforcing a little bit to me, Nathan.
Yeah, I remember another coach that I covered one time talking about the first time they got a head coaching job and some of the self-doubt that they felt at the time, and talking to the people around them, and somebody kind of stopping them and saying, like, it doesn't matter if you're the very best person that they could possibly hire in the world for this job. It matters if you're the right person at this moment. Like, you're the right person for this time. And I think that sort of applies to Ryan Day here. As he has talked about, we're going to go into some of the things he said recently on the Chris Holtman podcast, where he was talking about how he had been aligning himself closely with head coaches every step of the way leading towards Ohio State, not in anticipation of being Ohio State's head coach, but in anticipation of being a head coach. I mean, this had been the plan for him all along, and I'm sure that was expressed to Gene Smith early on as well. And I think if you also have to remember that this was someone who was, yes, coming in at any situation at Ohio State, I guess, is kind of a critical situation. But you're coming in with an infrastructure intact. You're coming in with a third year class at that time that was as talented as any as this program had ever had. So he was coming in at a juncture where there were a lot of ingredients for success that he didn't have to conjure. So I understand why, yes, you're concerned about a guy learning on the job, but I think what you do in these situations, sometimes people do it in our industry. You'll see sometimes very young people who get significant jobs, and it's because someone identifies a talent in them and says, we can put a structure around them that will allow them to grow into what they can be in that job. I think that happens in every industry, and this was just an example of that.
And what they also say sometimes is, I think this person's going to be good. Wait to see how good they're going to be in year 5. Wait until they get a little bit of a handle on this. And then they're going to be really good. And we've had the can't let the guy out the door conversations. Northwestern, tragedy with Randy Walker. You can't let Pat Fitzgerald out the door. Notre Dame, Brian Kelly leaves. You can't let Marcus Freeman out the door. Oklahoma, Bob Stoops steps down. You can't let Lincoln Riley out the door. Somebody else is going to take Lincoln Riley. And obviously, as everybody knows, Gene Smith referenced the Lincoln Riley hiring at Oklahoma a lot in choosing to hire Ryan Day. I do think Ryan Day had probably reached the point in the estimation of Gene Smith and Urban Meyer of don't let him out the door kind of guy. And would it have been ideal if Urban had stuck around for another year or two, like Ryan Day was only the offensive coordinator here for 2 seasons before he took over? Maybe, but this was the circumstance that happened. And it's funny to think now that part of the consideration at the time was, well, we want to keep this Urban Meyer thing rolling a little bit. And now, honestly, so that should be gone. It is gone, right? I do think it is. When Urban left at the time, even though he had the Zach Smith situation that led to his suspension for 3 games, which is where we got the first glimpse of Ryan Day as a head coach, I still think there was a lot of stuff at the time of like, well, there's a lot of good that Urban did. Let's keep that rolling. And then Urban goes to Jacksonville and bombs, and he has the thing on the bar stool, and it's like, I don't know, Urban, like, what are you doing? And then we have a comment later. It's like, why don't they have, I don't know, like Ohio State's not anymore, I don't think, super eager to lather itself in the Urban Meyer way of doing things, right? So I do think Ryan Day has sort of struck early on. They kept some of it rolling. Mark Pantoni, keep that rolling. Mickey Marotti, keep that rolling. Larry Johnson, keep that rolling. Tony Alford, keep that rolling. Brian Hartline, keep that rolling. The people who are around. But now Ryan Day really has established it. I think they actually managed that portion of it pretty well, that they kept sort of the best parts of Urban, but the Urban shadow, I think, is completely gone. Do you think there's an Urban Meyer shadow over this program in any substantive way anymore, Nathan? When you walk in the building, do you think an average player, coach, fan, booster would walk in that building and feel the ghost of Urban Meyer? No.
I would have said 0%, and part of that is the way that Urban Meyer's own career took a turn in the last couple years that maybe diminished a little bit of his presence. But you've lost two in a row to Michigan, so that brings a little bit of it back because he never lost to
Yeah.
Michigan. So so there is a little bit because people want the maximum of what Meyer's tenure could have been. That's what Ohio State is. We just had whole podcast about this. In some ways, that's kind of what Ohio State is chasing, I think, right now. At least what the fandom, a big part of the fandom wants them to chase is do what you're doing as far as like being right there on the cusp, dominate Michigan, and then just grab a couple more of those trophies than you were able to in the Meyer stretch. Whether that's won't rehash all that, whether that's realistic, but I think that is still where they are. So it's up to Ryan Day, I think, to he has to at some point start stirring in his own methodologies and personality and managerial style, all those things. It has to become something that he owns in a unique way. But I think it's some of that is about finding ways to turn the Ohio State level of success and keep that churning through the new whatever this next wave is going to look like, because I think that's going to be unique too.
So let me ask the question that led us to this podcast. What's your opinion of Ryan Day's progression and growth so far as a first-time head coach who is learning on the job at a place like Ohio State? What do you think the final evolution of Ryan Day as a head coach will look like? It's Will from the 419 living in the 717. And so Will sent this a while ago, sent it in late April, and I've been saving it because it was worth an entire podcast. It's like, hey, send rapid fire. Holy moly. This is a 90-minute rapid fire. So we saved it, Will. Thank you for the question. I will say this. Lincoln Riley lasted 5 years at Oklahoma. Lincoln Riley's first 4 years, 12-2, 12-2, 12-2, 9-2, 9-2 in the COVID year. Regular playoff participant, never wins a playoff game, and most of the time doesn't really look like, I don't know, like the 18 semifinal, they lose in double overtime to Georgia. They should have won that game. That would have changed, I think, the trajectory of Lincoln Riley's career. And by the way, that is a project we are undertaking on the College Football Survivor Show. We are re-watching that Georgia-Oklahoma playoff semifinal and thinking about Lincoln Riley and Kirby Smart, where they were then, where they are now, where they might be 10 years from now. But in terms of evolution, Lincoln Riley entering year 5 has the Heisman favorite at quarterback in Spencer Rattler, that they had just gone through some bumps to get him to that point. And there's a lot of things pointing up, and I think Oklahoma feels like, okay, the beginning of Lincoln Riley was really good, but now like we're about to get maybe the full-fledged Lincoln Riley. And that season goes sideways. Spencer Rattler's not very good. And Lincoln Riley bolts. So this comes up a lot because Lincoln Riley and Ryan Day are constantly compared on coaching lists. Shahan and I did it in the College Football Survivor Show. Like, how do you compare the two? Unless Ryan Day, like, has kind of a weird, not very good year and leaves after this season, I think like he's ahead, because that matters. That matters to me, Nathan. And the reason I'm bringing it up is it feels like Ohio State is about to get the next step in the evolution. And I feel like Lincoln Riley, when he was about to take the next step in his evolution, it went sideways and he left. And by the way, they still can't play defense, and he kept Alex Grinch, and I think he should have fired him. And like, we'll see if USC is evolved or not under Lincoln Riley. When you hire somebody like this, I do think you have to have a little bit of leeway. You can't lower the standards, but maybe, because even Tress, it's like, okay, well, but Tress had built a program and won 5 titles at Youngstown State. Tress was a proven winner. Ryan Day wasn't proven. He was a proven quarterbacks coach. He's a proven play caller. He's not three games running the program in 18. He did a good job. I don't think it was proven. I think you take some lumps, Nathan, to get to exactly where Ohio State and Ryan Day are now. And it turns out you made 3 out of 4 playoffs while you were in the taking the lumps phase. So if you think of it like that, and 2/3 of the people are saying, no doubt, absolutely the right thing. Okay, then you know you're hiring a guy who's never done it. He's not going to be the best head coach he's ever going to be on day one. He still made 3 out of 4 playoffs. We are perhaps about to embark on phase 2 of Ryan Day as a head coach. And by the time Urban Meyer got to Ohio State, he was in phase 3, probably. It's probably Bowling Green, Utah Urban. Then there's Florida Urban.
Yeah.
And actually, there might even be like phase 4 because there's like the Urban. Then he half quit, but he didn't really quit. Then, like, there's all kinds of. Tress was at least in phase 2, maybe phase 3. You know, like everybody. I think we've only ever been in phase 1 of Ryan Day. I don't think we've. If this question from the texter, which is so smart, what's the final evolution? I don't know that we've seen any evolution really until like right now. Maybe hiring Jim Knowles and demoting Kerry Combs. Maybe that's part of the evolution, right? Hey, you got to make a tough call. You love Kerry Combs. He's a great guy. Not getting it done. Going to hire a $2 million guy who I don't know. Maybe that's part of it. But I think, Nathan, we're right at an inflection point right here. And so I don't know what the end is, but I know that like we are in it. We're like in a growth spurt. I think Ryan Day is like 5-1. And by the end of the summer, he might be 5-9.
Yeah, I've brought up a couple of times in some other discussions how Ryan Day, at this stage of his career, this many years in, is, I think, inarguably farther along than Kirby Smart was. Like they've been more successful than Georgia was during that same time period. Not a completely fair comparison, I suppose, between Big Ten, SEC, whatever. But as far as getting in the playoff, having success there, like Ryan Day's ahead. And I think we've already. I don't know if the final evolution is an interesting question because we don't know what the time frame we're talking about here is. Like, is there, what we think finite evolution, what we think about the final evolution for Ryan Day is different if we think he has a 6-year tenure here, or if we think he has a 12-year tenure here, if we think he has a 20-year tenure here. You know what I mean? But I'm definitely seeing the evolution. I think we're all seeing the evolution. One of them came with just even the discussion of handing off the play calling. That was something that was not on the table at all until this past winter, really, in any serious way. And now we're pushing towards that. I think you've even seen it in previous years. I'm going to again make a comparison to Kirby Smart. I wonder what quarterback decision Kirby Smart would make today between Jake Fromm and Justin Fields. And I don't know if it was the wrong one when he made it. I understand why he did what he did at the time. It was kind of a rock and a hard place. But what would he do today? I think there's a ruthlessness that you have to either grow into and win with, or maybe don't ever acquire, and it probably gives you a ceiling. And we've seen Ryan Day do some relatively ruthlessly. I mean, the Kerry Combs situation, make some decisions that were, I'm sure, personally difficult for him. And yes, it was correcting a quote unquote mistake that he had made to set that up. But I think that's also part of the process. And I think maybe some more preemptive ruthlessness, if that makes any sense, would be part of the next stage of his evolution as well. And maybe Jim Knowles is an example of that, going outside of his comfort zone to find someone like that,
Yep.
as opposed to, and we've talked about this before, as opposed to some of the more comfortable hires that he'd made before that.
So this is one that we may have even talked about it here. This is like right after the Georgia game. And we have talked about this kind of idea. I just want to acknowledge it again. It's from the 513. If you're someone who's like, hey, Doug read a 6-month-old text on the pod. That's cool. It was mine. Maybe you remember you sent it or you don't remember. I think the loss to Michigan may have really opened up Ryan Day's mindset. He put on a masterpiece against Georgia. It was so evident he was coaching with nothing to lose. The true test will now be seeing whether or not he can sustain that in the normal run-of-the-mill game, as well as playoff games and Michigan. Also, his arc is shockingly similar to Kirby Smart. They've both been right on the cusp before they got the big one, and Day is right there. Him considering giving up play calling is a further example. Excited for what the future with Day looks like, drastically different than how I felt after Michigan. And again, that is in the aftermath of the Georgia game. I think that text, Nathan, speaks for a lot of people, which will lead us into what Ryan Day thinks about how he handled the Michigan game and the Georgia game. We'll do that right after this on Buckeye Talk. Doug Lesmerises and Nathan Baird, 614-350-3315. Again, the great texters drive this show, and we are always appreciative of that. It's a 2-week free trial if you want to try it. Nathan, you were referencing this is a podcast. Chris Holtmann has a podcast. He's the basketball coach, and he had Ryan Day on as his first guest, and this is where this discussion came up, which like sort of reignited like, oh, why are they talking about this in the middle of June? Ryan Day kind of said, right, it was a little, the name of the podcast is No Coach Speak, and it's like, well, I don't know. There's kind
Close
of
to Coach
coach
Speak.
speak in there, I think. But it's okay. It's interesting. Basically saying, right, that like maybe there are some things in terms of preparation, attitude toward the Michigan game that weren't exactly what they should have been, and maybe they learned some stuff from the Georgia game. And okay, is this going to be something that is adjusted for this season? Can you describe this conversation and what you thought it meant, Nathan?
So, I mean, technically the podcast is called More Than Coach Speak. So it's not telling you there won't be any
Oh,
Coach
sorry.
Speak, but it is going beyond Coach
Right.
Speak. And this was maybe the example of it. This was their one nugget because I thought he did, it was an admission on his part. I'm trying to find the exact quote here. Because he was basically admitting that from a mindset standpoint, something was off with the Michigan game. Here's what he said related to Georgia, at least. I think we did a better job in the Peach Bowl of, first off, just letting it all out and just playing aggressively and just looking to play the next play and win the next play and not looking at the scoreboard. What if we win? What if we lose? And really focusing on winning each situation and each play. That's something certainly I'll take from this past season that hopefully we can utilize going into 23, going into this season. And he basically said, I think the mistake I've probably made is we're going to win this game, the Michigan game, and the focus is on let's get after them, let's get physical, let's just beat them up. When you're playing in matchup games, when you play a team or player that's equal to you, you have to focus on winning every single possession, every single play. How do you do that? Through technique, focus, and eventually you're going to win the game. So maybe not sweating the small details enough with Michigan and looking at it as a program that's going to overcome a program instead of one-on-one battles that you have to win over the course of a day. And I think we've been talking about inflection points, and I'm curious how Buckeye Talk and everyone else that covers this beat will talk about those weeks in December, 5 years from now, and whether it was one of those inflection points, because it seemed like Ryan Day personally needed an answer. He was coming out after that game and saying, well, we need to do this. We need to be more aggressive. We need to play with more. I can't remember the exact wording that he was using at that point, but basically saying not be intimidated, not be worried about losing, and just let it all out. And that was the end result. I think you could argue that Peach Bowl is that the best game Ryan Day has coached, considering everything that
Well,
happened to hold Ohio State back in that game.
yeah, I mean, it probably goes back to the,
It's
recent
that or Clemson.
rewatchables we did on the
Yeah.
2020 Clemson game. But yeah, right.
So I mean, it's so it's I think it's both an admission. I mean, it's part of that. It's an insight into his learning process, and maybe sometimes you if you're going to fail, failure is going to happen. Now I'm going to do coach speak. Failure is inevitable, but what did you learn from the failure? How did you
Buckeye Talk.
change from the failure to avoid the failure the second time? And I think the Michigan loss seems like a failure. The Georgia loss to me doesn't seem like a failure, even though they're both losses. And maybe that's a semantic argument, but I think people know what I'm saying there. That in one instance, you had everything at your disposal, couldn't get it done, and actually looked like you shrank from the fight a little bit in that second half. In that second game, you were losing guys left and right, and you're still fighting them down to the last second of that game and nearly won and would have potentially gone on won a national championship from there. So I think that experience, those weeks, are going to maybe can be instrumental in the next stage that we see from Ryan Day, because he obviously sets a tone that filters down through this whole program.
One of the other things he said about the Michigan game, as you were sort of saying, like it's not about like the game as a whole. You got to win each play. Um, I think the mistake I probably made is we're going to win this game. Let's get after them. Let's get physical. Let's beat them up. And we said this last year, like, don't try to out physical Michigan. Do what you do best and focus on that against Michigan. And I mean, this is confirming, it's not the point, but it's like, we knew this. I'm glad he realized it. We knew this all last season. We knew it going into the game. We knew it after the game. Why are you trying to out physical Michigan? That's not what you're best at. Doesn't mean don't be physical, but don't beat Michigan up. Do what you do best. Have great technique, be focused, don't make mistakes. And so I asked, based off this discussion, what Ryan Day said, what most closely matches your feelings upon hearing Ryan Day say he didn't have the Buckeyes ready in the right way for the Michigan game last year? I feel better. He acknowledged a problem and now can fix it. I feel worse. How can you get the prep for Michigan wrong? I feel nothing. It's just coach speak. 71%, I feel better. He acknowledged a problem. Now he can fix it. 15% nothing. 14% I feel worse. Again, 7 out of 10, Nathan, like, okay, that's good. These are people, again, who are not, you don't get a pass, but there's an understanding of, okay, it's headed the right way. And there's another survey question that I asked Nathan, which is exactly that, like direction, right? Where the way it's headed. True or false? I think Ryan Day will be a better head coach in 2023 than he was in 2022. True, false, it'll be the same. True, moving in the right direction and growing, 86%. False, wrong direction, 1%. 13%, he'll be the same guy. These are people acknowledging you learn from mistakes and that I think would want to hear that. So if you take all these things, Nathan, right? So here's the thing. All that matters is whether you win. Now, to your point, I actually think that's not all that matters because exactly as you said, the Georgia thing, it's not a failure, it's just a loss. Sometimes a loss is a failure. It doesn't have to be a failure. Sometimes you lose. Michigan loss is a failure. I think they're at the point where no matter how often we say Michigan is good, whatever, like a Michigan loss is a failure, right? In this circumstance, especially once you've lost 2 in a row. But do you think are you surprised at all by the answers of so many people feel like I'm glad he acknowledged it, headed in the right direction? Or does this all make sense? Is this all fans agreeing with understanding this entire evolution idea for a guy entering year 5 as a head coach?
And the truly tough thing about Ohio State is sometimes a win can be a failure, or at least feel like one. You can point to
Exactly.
various ones that have happened these
Yep.
last couple of years, Maryland, Nebraska, whatever. And I think there is some acknowledgement here because I think people felt it's a tough thing, man, because we came out of that 2021 Michigan game with a lot of talk about, well, what's Ohio State going to do on 3rd and 2? Who's going to get the ball on 3rd and 2? Can they execute to get that 3rd and 2 that they didn't get in 2021 early in the second half that turns that game? And there are questions there about physical toughness, mental toughness that have to come into that. And I think what you hear now from Ryan Day is when he's saying part of it maybe is like not having the right game plan, I think, all week. But then I think there's a part of what he's saying is I had decisions to make in that moment. I had talented guys at each possible decision, but because the stakes were so high and the opponent we were playing was so good, I needed to probably lean more towards our identity than trying to beat their identity. And I think that's what we felt was happening in that Michigan game. I mean, to only score again, it one of the reasons why the Michigan game feels like a failure, and Michigan is very, very good, has been very good the last 2 years. It's clearly one of the best programs in the country. But why, when you only score 3 points at home in any circumstance in your Ohio State right now in a half, that's a failure. Like you can't leave your identity on the sideline like that. You've got to be more productive than that. And that's where it just felt like something was off. And I think if Ryan Day right now we're talking about we're laying this more on the players, we're laying this more on execution. I don't think that would be the message that anyone would want to hear right now because there's evidence that that's not the case. I think that to say that this is a problem that has to be fixed from the top down, and that the guy at the top recognizes what went wrong and how to maybe fix it this next time, is what is the message that needs to be going out. But as you say, you're at the tricky thing again right now is that you're at a juncture of this rivalry where Ohio State can come back out and play significantly better this year up at Ann Arbor and still not win that game, because that's it. It's a tough rivalry right now. This is an equated, more talented equated Michigan program that you're facing.
So one of the other questions, again, I'm not asking people to make their own list. It can't be homework. Generally speaking, where do you think Ryan Day ranks among college football coaches? Top 5, top 10, top 20? Honestly, not that great. Or he's the best, right? He's the best, 0%. Not that great. Plenty
Well,
of guys would do better. 1%. So, like, nobody thinks he's the best. Nobody thinks he's just a guy. 56% say top 5, around top 5. 40% top 10, 3% top 20. When Shahan and we did this like 6 weeks ago, I don't think either of us had him in the top 5. I might have had him 6 or 7. Shahan had him, I think, 11th. This again, and I'm not trying to say that people are wrong. Your people. Do your people think more of you than the general public, or less than you than the general public? I think right now, this survey is showing us that Ohio State, the people who responded to this survey, think more of Ryan Day than the general college football public. I don't think he's viewed as a top 5 coach right now. Now maybe he should be, but if you're going to go Kirby Smart, you're going to go Nick Saban, you're going to go Dabo Swinney and 2 national titles still. He made a ruthless move to bring in Garrett Riley, right? You're going to go Jim Harbaugh, and it took a while, but now he's built it up. And I'm not here to have a debate about whether Harbaugh or Day should be hired on a list like this. But there are enough people that you could get through before, it's not like Ryan Day's a slam dunk top 5. And people saying here, Nathan, 56% say top 5. I think this is a good sign. And I don't know in this situation how representative this survey is of the average Ohio State fans, because our tech subscribers and our listeners are loyal, dedicated, educated Ohio State fans, and there are some fans who are just angrier. I don't think that this subgroup of Ohio State fans in the Buckeye Talk family, I don't think this is the angriest subgroup. So even though we got the F-bombs after the Michigan loss, but that's just in the moment, we get that upon evaluation. But even that, Nathan, that any cohort of Ohio State fans are like, oh yeah, top 5. More than half the people think that. I think it's a good sign. Like, they think he's their guy. He's our guy. What are you talking about? And we're going to get to some answers that are basically that. What are you doing? He's our guy. I think that's good. I think that's good for the program. It's obviously good for Ryan Day. I think it's good for fans to believe in your head coach. And I wasn't, Nathan, 1,000% sure what these survey answers were going to be when I sent it out.
I think you're making a great point, and because everybody has either been part of a fan base or around a fan base where even when you're winning, you're kind of like, like, this guy, is this getting it done? I remember having Packers fan friends of mine from about a decade ago when, the Packers were winning a lot of games and the Bears were not. But talking to them, they would be like, man, this Mike McCarthy guy, like, where's this going? Like, what's going to happen here? And Mike McCarthy wasn't the Packers coach that much longer after that. And sometimes you see it early. It just doesn't feel right. Or you see examples of it not happening at the most crucial times. And I think there is certainly there have been times where Ohio State has not risen to the occasion in the most important games, but there have been times where it has. I think you're seeing both things, and it's all part of a growth process, and one of the things that's going to happen in a zero-sum thing, because Nick Saban doesn't win every important game he coaches in either. Not that I'm comparing, not that I'm saying Ryan Day is Nick Saban. So I think you're making an important point, and I'm very curious, like, what if we had done some of these same surveys in in December, January 2018, 19, where people would have been thinking about Ryan Day and how we could compare some of those same questions to now, because we're fans expecting some of this to be the case a little bit, that a guy's going to have to figure some of this out on his feet, and hopefully there's a long-term payoff, even if there's some short-term growing pains. And it's interesting because in the Lincoln Riley comparison, I mean, I would argue pretty strongly, even though Oklahoma was obviously in a playoff adjacent position soon after that, Ryan Day is obviously taking over a better situation. He's taking over a more complete roster, a more complete program for 2019, certainly. And you could argue whether that held true for the years after that, but they were in a better position the day he took them over. And I think for Lincoln Riley, you did not see a noticeable change in um, the pros and cons of whether that team was nationally relevant until the drop off then officially did happen. And I think that's maybe the next question with Ryan Day, like, and especially as it relates to defense, that's where you've seen a little bit of the bend, like whether he's going to continue the standard maybe that he inherited there. Again, 2019 is a hard one to live up to, but just get back towards that. Like, I think that's one of the ways that 2023 is a big year for him to start maybe answering any of those lingering doubts that are sort of hanging around the edge.
Part of the evolution of Ryan Day is the idea of, is he going to hand off play calling to Brian Hartline? He's preparing to do that. Brian Hartline was calling plays during the spring. As you brought up, Nathan, like, it hasn't been a complete final for sure handover yet. But I think the idea of that has gone over well with the fans, because I think it's a little bit about humbling yourself, and it's a little bit about sacrificing what's fun and what you actually want to do for the betterment of the program. And it's, again, as I've mentioned many times, as the people listening to this know, it was a constant conversation around Jim Tressel, and Jim Tressel never did it. And as much as people love Jim Tressel, there reached a point where people thought, you're winning, you're beating Michigan, we love how you run the program, people love Jim Tressel. Man, I sure wish we had a different offensive play caller. And Tress wouldn't do it. And Ryan Day is preparing to do it. I think I sacrifice is the wrong word, but putting what's best for the program first, and not sort of like just blindly saying, I'm the guy, I'm the best at this, you know what I mean? Like, I'm the answer. When I ask people who should call Ohio State's offensive plays, Brian Hartline, Ryan Day, or they should have hired an experienced outside coordinator, right? That if you think, well, I think that Day should give it up, but I don't know if Hartline's the right guy to do it. What do you think won? Day should call him, Hartline should call him, or they should have hired somebody from the outside, Nathan?
Well, it's not just wanting Day to pass it off. It was also wanting to keep Hartline here and advance him. So I think they would say that Hartline should call.
67% Hartline, 21% Day, 12% it should have been someone else from the outside. This is a head coach that the vast majority of people in this survey are supporting, and 80% of them are saying he shouldn't call plays. You don't do it to make the fans happy, but I think they appreciate where his thinking is here. And so, and I do think it's for the good of the program. And I think that he's not doing it for show, but that is a concrete version of evolution. That is a concrete, they're not just doing the same thing and hoping the results against Michigan change. I think that affects a decent chunk of this view. And I think it should, because I think this decision, Nathan, tells us a lot about Ryan Day, and it's gone over well with the fans. Now, if the offense comes out and isn't as sharp, and it's like, okay, well, I gave it over so you could be more of a CEO and be a culture coach, but oh my gosh, we really miss you on third down. We'll see what the reaction is to that, and we'll see what Ryan Day does. But the instinct here, I think, is I've said from the jump, I think it's the right instinct by Ryan Day, and it feels like the fans think it's the right instinct, Nathan.
But something you said in there actually triggered something in my head. I wonder if it's fair to call this the part of the evolution. Let me ask you this. If Ohio State had beaten Michigan the last 2 years, let's say nothing changes as far as the playoff. They lose to Georgia or Alabama or whoever in a semifinal in 21. They maybe they make the national championship game, lose to Georgia last season. But if they had won those 2 Michigan games, would we be talking right now about Ryan Day giving up play calling?
No.
So that's where it's not necessarily a natural evolution. It was more an adaptation. It's like adapting to a hostile environment.
And acknowledging a failure,
Right.
that the way we were doing it wasn't getting us where we wanted to go. And it wasn't having us beat our rival, which is at the top of the list of things we want to do. So it's one of those things, and coaches say this stuff all the time. Again, we're making fun of the coach speak show. We don't want to have coach speak here, but they always, it's like, it's easier to change after a loss. And it's like, well, it wasn't great. It could have been better. Well, we did win, though. I don't know. So the tooth losses to Michigan, maybe even if Ryan Day was feeling like, man, I could have a better grasp of the culture here. And I don't think there's a cultural problem, but he just wants to, I think, have better connection
Yeah.
to 1 through 105 on the roster. I could have better connection, but I don't know. I don't want to rock the boat. Like, this kind of working. I think maybe it would be better for me to have a little bit more influence on the defensive side of the ball, but I don't know, man. Like, haven't lost to Michigan yet. We keep making the playoff. Like, why would you change? But it hasn't been good enough. So I think you're right. And then it's one of those, this is the hard part. Did they lose to Michigan because Ryan Day was calling plays / was spending the time all year that it takes to be the play caller, which means he wasn't spending on other things? Is that why they lost to Michigan? I don't know. They blew some coverages. Aiden Hutchinson was good. Probably not. So then it's like, aha, you're changing the thing that maybe wasn't actually the reason that you lost, but I still think it's the right change. So I think you ask a good question, but I think the answer is pretty obvious on its face. And when you aren't maximizing yourself, you do look for changes. And I think this was a good one to look for. But do you personally, you, Nathan Baird, have any hesitation about Ryan Day's decision?
I don't have any hesitation about his decision to um, be more managerial and take a step back from that level of intricacy of the game plan and calling plays on Saturdays. I think, Brian Hartline will then now have to prove that he is worthy of doing that, if that's the person that they ultimately turn it over to. I don't think it's, we've had enough discussions on this program, and fans have it among themselves about decisions that are made in games, especially the most critical games. You can talk about the calls that were made on the last drive of the Georgia game. You can talk about why Ohio State scored 3 points in the second half against Michigan. You can talk about any number of things. Like the coordinator and the guy who's making that decision in the moment matters. Ryan Day will still be on that headset, but there is, you know, Brian Hartline hasn't done this either. And unlike Ryan Day, he was talking on that podcast when they were doing more coach speaky things. He was just doing more, biographical things. He was talking about how even back in high school, he was telling his future college coach, I want to be a coach. And this has been something that Ryan Day has been nerding on for a long time in a way that Brian Hartline hasn't. So we'll see if there's any like catch up that has to go on there and how smooth this transition is. But in general, the idea of stepping back, I think that it was a natural evolution that he would make that decision someday. It just wasn't a natural evolution why he made that decision this past winter.
I don't have any hesitation about Ryan Day making that decision. I do honestly have a little hesitation about Brian Hartline just because he's never done it. And I don't think, like you were saying, that that's how his brain automatically works. Because he's sort of said that. He's not a doodler. He didn't dream of doing this. He's a baller. He's a relationship guy. He's a get on guys and bring out the best of them. And those are a lot of great leadership head coach qualities. But I don't know if he's a schemer. It doesn't mean he's not. I don't know that we have as much evidence as there's a ton of evidence with Brian Hartline about why he's a good coach. I don't think the evidence in this area is as strong. So if Ryan Day was handing over play calling to a guy, it's like, oh, we hired this guy. Like there was a texter said, hire Garrett Riley. Well, it's one of those things. It's hard. Dabo Swinney doesn't really go near play calling. So you can bring in Garrett Riley and be like, here's the offense. Garrett Riley was the offensive coordinator. Lincoln's brother was the offensive coordinator at TCU last year. Dabo makes a ruthless move, hires a guy who'd been the quarterback's coach forever, who had taken over as the one-year offensive coordinator after Tony Elliott left. Didn't work. Bam. Whacked him. Ruthless. Brings in an outsider. But Garrett Riley isn't going to take that job under Ryan Day unless Ryan Day completely hands over the offense.
Mm-hmm.
Because the best guys want complete freedom, just like Jim Knowles has. Jim Knowles wouldn't have gone to a place. Jim Knowles wouldn't have gone to work for Kirby Smart because Kirby would have wanted a hand in the defense still. I don't think he would have done it. And just because Ryan Day right now is backing off Kirby, I asked Kirby about this when we were at the playoff semifinal, and he said he kind of goes in and out how much his hands are on the defense depending on the season, depending on the coaching staff. I do think, Nathan, there could be a world where if this handover is complete and Brian Hartline calls plays for 2 or 3 years and it's really good, and then Brian Hartline goes to be a head coach, I think Ryan Day could go back to be the play caller. Because then maybe it's like, listen, we've got a handle on all this other stuff. Now everybody knows how this works. So I know how I can still have my hands on every part of the program and be the play caller. So it doesn't mean he's never going to do it again, but you can go in and out based on the strengths of your own staff.
Yep.
So it doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean once he hands it to Brian Hartline, he couldn't take it back, right? I mean, so I think, but I do think the idea is the right idea. And I think that's what our texters are telling us here, Nathan.
Well, even in that scenario you're talking about, what will be the most important thing for Ohio State to figure out at that point if Brian Hartline were to leave for some better job? It would be, how do you replace all of the things that Brian Hartline does that Ryan Day can't really do as far as being the offensive coordinator? Like, you got to hire a really good receivers coach who can go out and recruit the crap out of the entire country the way Brian Hartline has. And that's going to be a big enough shoes to fill that I think you're right, that would be an option for them at the time. We don't know what staffs are going to look like at that point. I would also say, though, that, I mean, at some point in his career, Keenan Bailey's going to be an offensive coordinator. This would be really young for him to get maybe that kind of a bump only a couple years from now. But it's not like Brian Hartline is walking around with a gray beard either. He's not an ancient guy either. And I think Keenan Bailey's going to get that opportunity sooner than later as well.
And again, it's one of those things, the gulf between having the title of offensive coordinator and being the primary play caller and not. Right. You could, Brian
Yes.
Hartline does it well for 2 or 3 years, goes to be a head coach. You could make Keenan Bailey the offensive coordinator, but Ryan Day could go back to calling plays.
Correct.
Right. That kind of thing. So this is a response about sort of like some play calling things, hindsight from the 469. Now, these are responses that came off this survey. These are recent. Two of the questions in the survey were hard to answer. First, about who should call plays. I chose Ryan Day, but if Day wasn't going to call them, then I wish they would have hired someone like Garrett Riley or another up-and-coming offensive coordinator that had proven they can do the job. The other question, 2020 hindsight, Ohio State never really looked at anyone else, so it's hard to say who would have thrown their hat in the ring. Day has been great, but who might have shown interest? That's the hard part. And that's the thing, too. Basically, I think when you answer that question, Nathan, it really is about, would you risk losing Ryan Day or not? Because I guess what you could have done, I don't actually think it would have gone this way, but let's say it would have been this. Let's say Bob Stoops would have come out of retirement, Ohio roots. Bob Stoops comes out of retirement, but Ohio State kind of knows it's a short time thing. It's almost like, hey, we didn't really think Urban was going to leave quite yet. Let's let Bob Stoops sort of finish Urban's term. You know what I mean? But you think Bob Stoops is here for 4 or 5 years. Ryan Day is like, man, I thought I was ready. And Gene Smith says, you almost were, man. I love you. You almost were. I will write you a glowing recommendation letter for any job in the country. It's just that it's Ohio State and you've never done this. So Bob Stoops comes in and is the head coach at Ohio State for 4 years. And Ryan Day goes out and Ryan Day is the head coach at I can't think of a place.
Well, I mean, there've been some major, USC, Texas, like some major programs have turned over in the last.
One of those,
Florida.
But that's the whole point. But Florida, Billy Napier had been a head coach at Florida. Steve Sarkisian had a long resume. Lincoln Riley's Lincoln Riley. I don't know. Let's say Ryan Day doesn't get that level of job because those schools are like, well, if Ohio State's not going to hire him, why would we hire a guy who's never been a head coach that has no connection to our program and Ohio State didn't hire him? So let's say he goes and is the head coach at Mississippi State, which offered him the job before. And now here we are, and Bob Stoops just retired. And Ryan Day is entering year 1 at Ohio State with 4 years at Mississippi State under his belt. He's learned. He knows how to do this. He knows how to run a program now. And now he's coming in right now. Would that be better? Or would you rather have year 5 Ryan Day with the 4 previous years at Ohio State and maybe a couple Michigan losses, maybe some bumps along the way, also 3 out of 4 playoff appearances, and now all the learning he's done, you own all the learning? Or would you rather had Bob Stoops for the last 4 years? Now here comes Ryan Day. Maybe Stoops, he's from Ohio. He hates Michigan. Stoops, man, Urban and Stoops are boys, man. Urban had an office. Urban was hanging out the whole time. I don't know. Could you make more than 3 out of 4 playoffs? That's a lot. I don't know. Could Bob Stoops win a lot of games with Chase Young and Jeff Okuda? I guess. Kevin Wilson, he would have stuck around and called the plays. Like, what would you rather had, right? And now you get Ryan Day. Do you think so now you're at the same place. So what would you rather have now? Year 5 Ryan Day at Ohio State, or year 1 Ryan Day at Ohio State, who has 4 years at Mississippi State? And then what would you have rather had? The last 4 years of Bob Stoops, who'd been through the ringer, or the last 4 years of Ryan Day, who won a whole lot of games and made 3 playoffs, but was learning on the job? Because I think that might have been the choice. And the result might be, we're at the same place right now, but would you have been happier or less happy with the past 4 years? That's an impossible question
Right.
to answer, and we didn't prep it before the show. Please answer it succinctly in the next 15 seconds.
I think you would take year 5 Ryan Day, because you don't know for sure what these past 4 years would have been. And all of the reasons why we think Ohio State could be successful, very highly successful in the short term, a lot of them directly relate back to Ryan Day. It's the yin and yang of the quarterback and receiver recruiting that's gone on here. It's what Jim Knowles could possibly do in his second year. You've seen incremental growth at every stop that he's made. What can he do in his second year? Despite the problems last year, I think he clearly knows what he's talking about. In general, while there have been some positional problems in recruiting, in general, the recruiting has remained at an excellent level. The blue chip ratio just came out this week. They are second in that again for the second straight year. Like 85% of their roster or whatever is 4 and 5 stars. Only Alabama's been higher the last 2 years. Like all of those things were Ryan Day demonstrably taking the torch and keeping a really high level of success going here. It hasn't ultimately led to a national championship, but as we talked about on the pod last week, it's those zero-sum things are very, very tough to hold someone to in a short window. So I think you would take year 5 Ryan Day. We're having a conversation right now about his evolution and what he's learned and how much better he could be. It's not like there's a pile of losses that he has to answer for over these past 4 years.
This is mostly a conversation for our listeners to have with their friends. What would
Right.
you rather have? 4 years of Bob Stoops and Ryan Day is entering year 1 at Ohio State, or year 5 of Ryan Day? What would you rather have right now for 2023 with Ohio State, which I think is pretty clearly you'd rather have year 5 Ryan Day. That's the whole point of taking the lumps. But do you think Bob Stoops would have won a national title? Would have beaten Michigan one more time, 2 more times? I don't know. Have that conversation with your friends. There's no right answer. This is from the 937. I think the offensive play caller question should have had another option, and that is Hartline's the play caller, but Day still has the final say. Trust Hartline to call the plays, but Day should step in when needed. Hartline has never done this before, and it's a huge deal. It's very well said by the texter, Nathan. I actually think that might be what it is. That it's like, okay,
Yeah.
You're in the meeting, right? You're running the meetings. You've got first down. You've got second down. You're running my plays. We know the philosophy, but all right, it's 3rd and 6 in the middle of the third quarter, tie game. It's do or die. Ryan's going to be on there. Ryan's not turning off the headset. He's not going Brady Hoke. He's not taking the headset off.
No.
Even though in practice I made a big deal out of, hey, you didn't wear the headset today. He's letting them learn. He's going to have it on during the games. 3rd and 6. Brian, I think we got to go this here. And I don't think Brian Hartline's going to be like, shut up, Brian, let me choose. It's like, okay, no, like I do. Don't you have some expectation that like when it's brass tacks and the guy who's been in that situation a million times, Ryan Day, and again, just like Urban always said, Urban wasn't the play caller. Urban had veto. Urban always said, I have veto. And a lot of this is like, as Ryan Day has explained, you know what your 3rd and medium calls are. Oh, it's 3rd and 5. We're going to run one of our 3rd medium calls. We've only worked on 5 all week. It's going to be one of these 5 plays. because these are the plays that we worked on in practice that we want to run on between 3rd and 3 and 3rd and 8. It's what we want to do. It's not 70,000 plays to choose from. It's 5. And, 3 are a pass, 1's a run, and 1's a play action deep shot. And Ryan Hartline says, all right, let's take the play action deep shot. And Ryan Day says, I don't like the way the safety's playing. Let's run this other route, right?
Yeah.
I do think that will happen, Nathan. So I think you might end up getting the exact sort of best of both worlds that this texter's implying.
Well, yeah, I try to always be analogous to like our profession or just people's jobs in general. And I think like our boss, Dave Campbell, doesn't say, here's the words I want you to write about this article. He says, hey, what are we writing? What are you doing about this issue that's out there? What article are you writing about that? And I think, if you're in advertising and you need to come up with an ad campaign, I don't think your boss says, here are the words I want you to go write. He'll say like, okay, this is a client, you need to come up with a thing to pitch to them. And I imagine it's not that dissimilar even in, the fourth quarter of the Notre Dame game where it's tight and you have to make a third down decision. I don't know that Ryan Day, even in that case, if he is turning this over, it's probably more like, what are we doing to decide this? I think you do. It's very rapid fire, but you also have some time to talk these things out a little bit. And it would be awesome to be on the headset with them through these first 4 games or so this year. There's some things that obviously have to be decided about Brian Hartline's circumstances here to start the year, but assuming this is getting turned over to him, he does have an interesting progression where you've got some non-conference games here that are kind of tailor-made for both a new quarterback and a new offensive coordinator to maybe get their feet under them a little bit. But then you've got like games 4 and then some Big Ten, the Notre Dame game, and then some Big Ten games early on where the stakes are going to be pretty high. So if those are tight late, what is the process? How does Ryan Day, does he grab it back? And what are the ramifications of that for the next time that scenario comes up? Or is this one of those situations where you have to be part of the learning process and you have to, it's now your job, instead of making the decision, is to guide people through the decision. And that can sometimes be more challenging. I think there's probably are times where our boss wishes he had the time to just be like, okay, I'll just do it instead of whatever you're writing about this. But he's got to guide us to the right way to do it. Everybody who's listening to this, either they are a boss who does that or has a boss who has to do that, and that's what Ryan Day's role is going to be going forward.
So let me here. I think I've talked about this before. I don't think I'm breaking new ground here. So Ohio State in the 2013 Big Ten championship game, they have a 4th and 2. They're trailing Michigan State by 3 points with 5:41 left. They have a 4th and 2 at the Michigan State 39-yard line. And just talking to people over the years, this is my understanding of it. I'm not saying it's 100% right. This is my understanding of it. They wind up running the ball with Braxton Miller, kind of like a little wide run. Jeff Hireman has a block to make. If he makes the block, it actually might pop Braxton. The Michigan State guy gets around Jeff Hireman and makes the tackle on Braxton Miller. And Ohio State stopped. Michigan State scores. Now they're up 2 scores, and that's basically it. My understanding is Tom Herman wanted to give the ball to Carlos Hyde on 4th and 2 on that play. Tom Herman as the play caller. You're the play caller. He's the offensive coordinator. There's no doubt that Tom Herman's the play caller there. But guess what? When it came down to it and the game was on the line and you're taking all the things into account, the boss made the call. And the boss said, I want the ball in my hands, in the hands of the best player. Who's Braxton Miller? Nobody disputes the best player on that team was Braxton Miller. So the play caller wants to call a play. All right, we're going to do this, but we're going to hand it to Carlos Hyde. The coach, Urban always was this. Urban was always, I think, and he talked about this a lot, number of touches. Like, it's really more about the guys. So that's an example. So it didn't work. But again, you make the block. It does work, probably, right? Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. But in the moment, I don't know that the offensive coordinator made the offensive call with the season on the line. So trying to think about how this is going to work, any head coach that has a headset on always has that.
Hmm.
And so Ryan Day, at the very least, is going to have that, Nathan, and he might have more for a guy who's never done it. Tom Herman had been around the block at Ohio State, at Iowa State before, and he called plays a lot more than Brian Hartline has done it so far now, which is none. So just have that for all of our lists, that's in your head that Ryan Day is going to be there. And it's really more about during the week, as we've said, but in the biggest moments, the experience of someone who's done it before will be there with the guy who's never done it before. But I think hopefully, Nathan, more often than not, Brian Hartline's going to call the play that is exactly the play that's in Ryan Day's head. And there's a lot to that. But that Brian Hartline is vocalizing it. Brian, it's your call. And as he's doing it, Ryan Day's like, yep, that's it. That's the right thing. In this offense, with this game structure, the way the defense is playing, the way our guys are blocking, that's the same call I would make. But it's so empowering to let Brian Hartline make it. And by the way, Ryan Day might have saved 2 hours during the week not being there, having to help make that, right? So I think for anybody who's like, well, we're losing Ryan Day as a play caller, you're not. He's still a mentor and a guide, not just during the week, but on the headset on Saturdays too.
And I'm also really curious how they're going to handle the oversight and review process, because I imagine that is going to have to be a bit of a factor here. It's not all going to be real time reaction, just like anything else. It's you go back over the film, and then you bring the players in and you go over what they did well, what needs to be better, and how will that process work out with Ryan Day and Brian Hartline if this is a full handover, or when this is a full handover. Because even though you're taking a step back, that's actually something you're kind of adding into the week, I suppose. But I think there was probably already some of that early in the week anyway, right? Like you saw kind of the later in the week process of planning for a game, but I think there's an earlier in the week process where the coaches do some review kind of thing anyway. So, but that's going to be, again, it's part of transferring from the operator to the foreman, kind of. He's or you know what I mean, like it's more the CEO than the worker.
I just didn't know how much consternation there was about any of this Ryan Day stuff. This is from the 419. This is also referencing the pod where we were talking about national championship standards. And I was like, I don't know. Does Ohio State need a Rich Rod reset for people to appreciate what they have? Doug, does Ohio State need a Rich Rod? Come on. That's probably the right answer. Number one, that's taking this survey way too serious. Just look around on game day. People are having fun. So much fun, the stadium could be a little more rowdy and intense. Second, the survey questions could be improved if you wanted to take it to that intensity. I'm disappointed they didn't win, but I'm happy they had a great season. Both are true. Keep the faith in us. You let us dive into the intricacies of our feelings, which is the escape from my stupid house needing painted. It's the escape from this guy's house needing painted. But it's a love relationship, not a love-hate for most fans, I believe, and certainly all the fans that I know from the 419. I just thought that's a little bit about that previous survey and that discussion, Nathan, but I thought it applied here of like, I don't know, are people fired up? Oh, they lost 2 to Michigan. Are people mad at Ryan Day? And this guy's reminding us like, man, there's a lot of people who love Ohio State and like love what's going on. And if you lose, you're sad, but like they're not freaking out. So I just wanted to drop that in there as a reminder to everybody. The overall question, how much faith do Ohio State fans have in Ryan Day? We have survey questions specifically on that and some answers and comments. We'll do that next on Buckeye Talk. Nathan, the people who do have faith kind of really have it. And they almost get mad, which is good. That's why we ask questions like this. Maybe because the question itself makes you so mad, it really brings something out of you in your response. Like this from the 937. I get so frustrated about the disrespect Ryan Day gets as a football coach. He is in modern times the exact coach any great program should want. On the field, offensive-minded head coach, consistently top recruiting classes, wins all the games he should, and willing to adapt if something is not working. Off the field, attention to mental health, the culture and high-character players he brings in, and the way he presents himself in front of the microphone are second to none. In my opinion, he has no red flags as a coach or person. I get it. He's lost some big games and some Michigan games. We will not win every single game. It's not possible. He's a great coach, and there is nobody else plausible that I'd rather have, including Mike Vrabel. So That's when you ask questions like this, Nathan, we want that kind of smart passion on either side, however it comes, but it's a reminder that there are people who feel this way. From the 502, it's JD from the 502. Ryan Day has made Ohio State's culture better than Urban Meyer's culture. As a former coach who led a track team to a state championship, humble brag, but context, you're allowed to do that. It's extremely hard to walk the fine line of killer mentality and mental healthiness. Sure, Urban won big games, but at what cost? Look at the wake of destruction he left behind him in a myriad of testimonies about his toxic intensity, lack of character development, turning a blind eye to obvious issues for the sake of winning. He left with, yes, a 7-0 record against Michigan, but a tarnished name. Don't get me wrong. He's not all bad, but it took a toll on his health, his family, and Buckeye Nation. Ohio State is more than just football. Crazy to say, I know. But growing up a Buckeye was, yes, about beating Michigan, but more so about a dedication to excellence, living with honor, and the brotherhood, which I think extends to all those who call themselves Buckeyes. The football team for my family was supposed to represent the best of us in this way, playing with ferocity, but class, playing with poise, character, and passion, striving to be the best, but for the sake of the team. These are all things I try to emulate in my own life, but also things that I instilled in our track program, who had never finished higher than fifth. It took 4 years to establish the championship culture, 4 years, but then won it all. And culture is everything. It's the mentality and lifestyle that creates the opportunity to win a championship. Everything from fostering a desire to focus to the fundamentals. So, this is a coach who said it took 4 years. They won a championship in year 5. I think not coincidentally, Ryan Day is entering year 5. I think we knew it, Nathan, and I have a couple more. I think we knew it, but it's a reminder. I wasn't 1,000% sure we'd get texts like this. Were you 1,000% sure we'd have some Ohio State fans say things like this?
Some, sure. Yeah. Because I think people,
Okay.
there are things about Ryan Day also that, again, it's the program hasn't fallen off a cliff, and I think there are things about Ryan Day as a guy, as a person, that people really connect with and people really appreciate, and there is a portion of the fan base that actually matters for. There may be another portion of the fan base that's like, I don't care how much of a scoundrel the guy is, as long as he wins, and there's some value to both of those opinions. But that doesn't seem to be the case with Ryan Day, and I think that there are people who see the big picture here, that the program is still on a national championship contention annual trajectory, and that what you also, there's that, and then when you add in just, I think, the character of Ryan Day that he's demonstrated thus far, I think people see that as an overall winning formula that they're glad to be attached to.
From the 513, here are my thoughts on Day. I think he is absolutely the right guy for this job. I keep going back to the Kirby Smart comparison, Nathan, as you do. But it just makes sense. And he's figuring it out with far less experience than Smart had. Regardless, I also believe that his admission to the Michigan game is a good thing, what we talked about before. He could have gone a million different ways, but I truly believe he looked in the mirror and acknowledged he didn't do his best work. That being said, I also believe Day is the kind of guy who wants to prove them wrong and do it in the best way imaginable, i.e., winning a title. That being said, I think with all of the criticism coming his way, it will motivate him to stay at Ohio State and win multiple championships. I don't think he's going to settle for one and jump to the league. I think he sticks around and makes a point to everyone who doubted him. That is Ryan from the 513. Let's do another one here. From the 614, I have a weird trust that Ryan Day will figure it out, even though he's done nothing to gain my trust outside of winning games he was supposed to win and unleashing the Michigan climax on Clemson that one time in Georgia last year. He just seems so smart that whatever he did for those 2 games, I think he'll find a way to let that energy out on the right week eventually. But if we're being honest, probably not soon enough, definitely not this year. So that's like, I believe in him, but I actually think they're going to lose to Michigan for a 3rd straight time. Which, again, I'm not making fun of that opinion, because you can have that opinion.
Sure.
I believe in this guy, but also, like, I don't know, Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum, right?
Yeah.
As far as the confidence level in Ryan Day, I gave it a 9. The only reason it wasn't a 10 is because right now there's a Michigan issue, but I believe sooner or later he'll get that figured out. As far as play calling goes, the more I think about it, the more comfortable I am with Hartline as a play caller. This is from Anthony and Finley. I appreciate that he's taking accountability for his shortcomings, just like Jim Knowles did earlier this offseason about his aggressive play calling. So I think, again, and he said that he likes like this CEO approach and freeing some things up. So again, I think there's a lot of things that Ryan Day is doing, both what he's saying and the actions he's taking that I think are connecting with a lot of people, Nathan. One more. My rant is that anyone who is legitimately questioning Ryan Day's ability to lead this program needs to calm the heck down. This is from the 740. All of the negative comparisons, John Cooper, Larry Coker, Mark Helfrich, if he was Cooper, he'd still be winless against Michigan and years away from a team that could legitimately contend for a national title. If he was Coker and Helfrich, we'd see clear signs of erosion at this point. But guess what? Ohio State is one of the healthiest programs in the sport, and he's led Ohio State to 3 playoff appearances while Urban only did it once. Urban actually did it twice. Man, this gets me fired up because that was all caps there for a while. Love all caps. I could care less about Ryan Day on a personal level, and if he left for the NFL tomorrow, I'd be happy for the ride, but ready for the future. But at the very least, the image he projects is of a decent guy who recruits decent young men, and yes, he has shortcomings, but oh my goodness, a human with imperfections? People have had their brains poisoned by having a coach in Tuscaloosa who belongs in the Ali, Gretzky, Jordan, Wooden tier of people in sports with untouchable records of success, and a guy in Athens who adopted the same model and has literally gotten the state to rewrite the laws to better succeed and to obfuscate what's going on with his program so players can drag race all they want to, apparently. This is Nick Saban and Kirby Smart. Ohio State has clearly demonstrated that they are only willing to go like 98% as far as the SEC and like programs who are in pursuit of success. And within these constraints as well, having never been a head coach of anything ever, more caps, Ryan Day has simply been winning 90% of his games. This is from the 740. That's mostly facts, and it's just a matter of like, how do you take them in, right? So love the passion, love the all caps. A little more complicated from the 740. I don't trust Day on Michigan, but I hope others on the staff will keep us on track. Let's see. This person actually wanted Luke Fickell to be the head coach. And that's the main thing. He was like, you asked the whole wrong question. It's like Luke Fickell should have stuck around and you could have built with that. But it's there's complexity in there that he's not given up on Day. But I think it's okay to acknowledge complexity as well. But Nathan, in the end, there was more passion around the people who have faith in Ryan Day than the people who don't. Which again is where do the people, where you planting your flag? And I think the frustration, the natural disappointment after the Michigan loss, I think in the end, there are more people planting their flag with him than against him, which again, I just wasn't 100% sure about.
I think there's also people, and I fall into this category, who, while the head coach, has the ultimate responsibility, it's not as if Ryan Day was the only person who wishes they had certain plays of the last 2 Michigan games back. There are position coaches, and there are certainly players on the field who lost their one-on-one battles and didn't execute the right way. So it yes, the ultimate responsibility falls on Ryan Day, but it's not as if he is directly, I think, responsible at fault for every single thing that goes wrong in any single game that they lose. So that's an important perspective that I think some people also have here. I think you again, you have to just look across college football. I'm going to come back to this because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about in the last couple of weeks, that because we've talked about this in other contexts. And I think there are a lot of coaches who, when when Cade Stover goes out, when they're already without their starting running backs, and when Marvin Harrison Jr. gets hurt, like their team is not within 1 point of beating the 2-time defending national champions in the fourth quarter. And I think Ryan Day should get some credit for that. Part of that is recognizing and developing C.J. Stroud. Part of that is recognizing uh, Xavier Johnson and keeping him in a role where he could step up and help your team. Whereas on another program, maybe he gets more diminished and more kind of left off to the side. This team is full of receiver talent, but yet they take this former walk-on and they keep him in a prominent place because he's proven that he should be. Any number of other examples I think you could make. So I would just, as much as I was the one saying, yeah, I think about every 10 years this team should be winning a national championship on that last pod. I don't think that Ryan Day is dragging this program by any means. I think Ryan Day has kept this program in position to win a national championship every 10 years, and that is a significant accomplishment.
Couple people with a little less faith. This is Marlon from the 734. I rewatched the Michigan game, and I was talking to a Michigan alum in his 50s who asked me where I am on Ryan Day. The survey was perfectly put together to align with my feelings. I've been in a pretty bad mood since rewatching. Evaluating Day is complex. Against Pete Clemson, Georgia, and Bama, I get it. That's tough. But man, you have to handle Michigan and Oregon and Notre Dame and Penn State and Wisconsin the majority of the time. Kings of the North. They should be 2-2 versus Michigan. That's always worth noting, right? The COVID game was wiped out. It's also worth noting how bad the Big Ten was when Urban took over. He dealt with good Michigan teams, but they cycled down right after a good season. So I'm not interested in hearing disparaging comments from Buckeye players that beat 9-3 and 8-4 and 7-5 Michigan teams. But the comedy of errors in that game, the last Michigan game this past season, leaves me with no choice but to think that they were not prepared. The Buckeyes were not prepared. The false starts, the unsportsmanlike penalties, mistakes in all three phases, they were not prepared. Is Michigan's coaching staff superior? If so, that's a problem. Yes. I want Day to keep calling plays. We have no clue how good Hartline's going to be. And yes, I think Day is learning and growing as a head coach. Michigan is good. We're going to have to deal with losses. That said, Day has to make sure he handles Wisconsin and Notre Dame in 23. Can you imagine the outcries for Luke Fickell if he doesn't? I think that is a completely reasonable discussion of Ryan Day. And I wanted to evaluate Ryan Day as on the whole versus Ryan Day versus Michigan, and we're going to do that before we leave. This is from the 419. I've really enjoyed the pods you guys have done recently leading up to this poll. I remain a big believer in Day, and yet I do have serious concerns. I waffle at times on whether I think he freaks out too much over Michigan or whether he doesn't take the rivalry seriously enough. I think that is like all that matters is the results. And so then you try to backdate it. It's like, well, did they? And I don't know what the answer is to that, but I do think it's part of what Ryan Day is probably thinking about right now. One thing that confuses me is I would really think he'd be leaning hard on Urban for advice and mentoring him through the Michigan dilemma. We can't pretend Urban never played good Michigan teams. I think my bigger Day concerns, though, lie in recruiting and development. Maybe I'm just a spoiled, naive Buckeye fan, but it feels like Georgia and Bama don't have the same kinds of backbreaking decommits that have plagued Ohio State in recent years. We just recently had a pretty poor recruiting class that we're going to have to watch coming down the pipeline like the 19 class did. And then the failure to fix tackle in the portal surprised us all. And then somehow we're supposed to brush off the Dylan Raiola incident because of Nebraska, and he didn't even end up going to Nebraska. Can all these issues be explained away? Sure, to some extent. Or do we take a step back and realistically say the gap between the talent we have on the roster and the talent we have at various points that we thought we'd have is pretty significant? I do think there's some stuff in like locking down guys. But again, some of this is an NIL discussion, and we think maybe that's changing too. My gripe with Day can be summed up in this. We see issues coming down the pipeline for a while that we all think will get addressed, and it doesn't. Having an unprepared quarterback face Oregon is an early example that sticks in my craw because I was watching that develop for an entire year. I still like Ryan Day, though, from the 419. Again, I don't think this is people, Nathan, bringing up ridiculous things to bring up. Final one, rant. Does anyone really believe that Day has a handle on how to deal with Michigan, especially after last year's debacle? I thought that 2022 was the year he learned from 2021. My main issue with Day is that he thought he could always overcome having an average or below average defense, and that shows with his hiring of Kerry Combs, his low emphasis on defensive recruits, and how little he wanted to oversee it. My issue here is that for the last 2 years, whatever Day is learning from his own mistakes is not catching up as fast to be on top for the rivalry, and he's losing the momentum. I would argue that the rise of Michigan was in part because of Day's complacency, and it felt that he took winning the game for granted. That's our guy, Colin, who always has good opinions on stuff. So, in the end, even what Colin brings up, Nathan, some of the stuff like defensive recruiting, the defensive coordinator, it feels like they're trying to fix some of that. I do think the defensive recruiting, right? Ryan Day is going to try to be more involved in defense. They hired a $2 million a year defensive coordinator they didn't have any connection to. Some of the things, I think, this is where I think I land on. I think there are absolutely reasonable criticisms of Ryan Day. I'm not sure that there are any criticisms, real reasonable criticisms, that they're ignoring. Do they need to land some bigger time defensive recruits? Probably. They brought in James Laurinaitis. They feel like they're getting NIL lined up. I think maybe that'll help. Do they need better defensive play? They hired Jim Knowles. So that's part of it, Nathan, that I think to say that Ryan Day has been infallible, I think is wrong. But I think the idea that you try to see how they're trying to get better at the things that have tripped them up while maintaining a high level of the things they do well. That's what it feels like they're trying to do. And in June, I think that's what you focus on.
Yeah, and again, like you started this off by, the comparison to Urban Meyer and how much that is hanging around. Let's not forget that as strong as Ohio State still was in seasons like 2020, 2021, some of their downfall directly linked back to failures of the previous coaching administration, especially as it related to recruiting, especially as it related on defense. So nobody's perfect. You're and that's ultimately what can be tough about this is you're holding people to sort of a standard of perfection in a zero sum situation sometimes, and that's what they've signed up for. That's why they are compensated the way they are to some extent. But I think ultimately it's whether you think the person in charge recognizes where they haven't um, performed, and what are they going to do about it. And I think you could probably give me examples of where that happened with Urban Meyer and he addressed it. And we've already detailed all the times it's happened with Ryan Day, and it's ongoing. I'm sure he'll get to the end of 2023 and have something. I think Kirby Smart probably got to the end of 2022 this past season and had things that he wanted to tweak, even after winning 2 national championships. That's where it's really more part of an evolution than being forced to do something. I think that's where it is part of more of a natural evolution, and that's a hard thing to get to, but that's what separates the guys at this level.
Last part of the survey, what is your level of faith in Ryan Day right now? 10 is complete faith. 1 is almost no faith. Nathan, do you want to guess on the 1 to 10 rating system what the average was for that?
I mean, based on the previous ones, I would think it's pretty high, like an 8.7.
That's a good guess. 8.03. And 8 was by far the most popular response. More 9s than 7s, about the same number of 10s as things below 7. So 8.03. And then how important is this season? Year 5 for Ryan Day. 10 is incredibly important, almost a make or break year. 1 is like, it's just another season. What do you think that was on a scale of 1 to 10?
Maybe somewhere lower than that. Maybe somewhere in a 7.2.
That's a good guess. 7.96. So it's actually pretty much almost the same. It's right around an 8 for both. That idea. And I think, what is a make or break year? It's like, well, probably don't lose a game that would be unexpected. And I think anything other than Michigan, even though Wisconsin's going to be good and Notre Dame's going to be good and Penn State's going to be good, I think most Ohio State fans are expecting Ohio State to win those games. And then it's, are you going to beat Michigan and are you going to make the playoff? I do think I'm an 8 or a 9. It's not make or break, but I do think it's, if it doesn't go very well, and what is very well? I don't think they have to make the playoff. I kind of think they must have. I don't want to say they have to beat Michigan. I don't think they can lose to Michigan. If they lose to Michigan and don't make the playoff, if they have the year they had in 2021, I think this conversation next offseason would be maybe somewhat significantly different. So I think it's a pivotal year because if it doesn't improve, and again, how do you improve? Well, you beat your rival. I don't know. I think if it doesn't improve, it sets up 2024 to maybe feel like a borderline make or break year. Because at some point, even me is like, Michigan's good. You're not going to beat your rival every year. It's like, how many years in a row can you lose to Michigan before it's a thing? So I think if they beat Michigan and make the playoff, all of this is gone. I think he's practically a 10 then, right? What else? Then you're just waiting for a national title. Beat Michigan, make the playoff. You're as good as anybody. Oh, man, they lost a big game again, but you got to go over the top. But it's just there's no other conversation. If you lose to Michigan, now you've lost 3 in a row, and now it's getting harder for the people to have faith. It's harder to have faith. So for that, I do think it's like an 8 or a 9, Nathan. Not because it is a make or break year, but it determines if 2024 is a make or break year.
Yeah, and I understand why there's a lot of emphasis on the Michigan game, as there should be, but I think there are a lot of big questions hanging out here that aren't game result dependent. It's um, the question that we just talked about with Brian Hartline and the play calling, and do you fully commit to that, and what does that look like? You have a first year starting quarterback now. Your whole philosophy has been we're going to get one great quarterback in each class, because what if we're wrong one year? And that way you should never really have a real fall off in terms of your quarterback performance. Not that they're going to be latter years of Fields or Stroud, but can they keep up that same level of performance? Jim Knowles, this was supposed to be a long-term fix to the defense. So does the whole defense take a step forward? Do the guys that you thought were going to be great third-year players when you recruited them and have been developing them, does that happen in this third year? Like, there are a lot of questions that, as Ryan Day was kind of even alluding to, that are the elemental things that are going to decide whether or not they beat Michigan. And I think they're big questions that are going to have to be answered over the course of this season. But I agree with you that, and then there's some other factors in here too. It's the last 4-year tournament as opposed to the 14 tournament, I should say, as opposed to the 12-team tournament. Like little things like that. The last time that the Big Ten has this structure, what is that going to mean? There's a lot of little things like that that make this season unique compared to what we are then going to, the reality we're going to live in from 2024 on. And plus now you add USC in, and that adds a whole nother element. So it is kind of a season unto itself a little bit. A lot of transition. Some of it is being triggered by Ryan Day, decisions he's making. And how do you transition through this into what's going to be a very new reality for college football starting next year?
Last two survey questions, and we'll wrap this up. Nathan, I asked these two questions because I wanted to see how big the gap would be. You ask people to rate something on a 1 to 10 scale. It's a similar question, but it's not the same. But what's the gap? True or false? I trust Ryan Day to lead the program overall in recruiting, strategy, hiring, and all the things the head coach does. True or false? I trust Ryan Day to have the Buckeyes ready to play their best game against Michigan. Do you think there's a pretty big gap in the answers to those questions? Or do you think, no, it's you trust the guy or not? It's
Well,
pretty similar.
yeah, I don't want to get into I think there probably is a gap. Whether it's a significant gap, I don't know. I mean,
How,
go ahead.
how big of a gap? How many percentage point gap do you think there is between overall faith and ready for Michigan faith?
13%.
Yeah. So overall faith is very, very high. And it is 94%. Michigan faith is 71%. So it's a 23-point gap.
Yeah.
And like, it's almost like if your rival didn't exist, or if you didn't have a rival that mattered this much. Most teams, everybody has a rival. Nobody has a rival that matters this much. So that again, I think is a little instructive. I don't know that we're surprised by that, because I think we feel like 51 weeks out of the year, there are not a ton of problems that people have with Ryan Day. And then 1 week out of the year, they're just not sure. And actually, they mean, well, what do you do in the other 51 weeks before you get to that 1 week to make sure you're ready? But I think that reflects what we think. It reflects what we've been talking about since the end of the season. It reflects where I think most people would believe the Ohio State fan base is right now. And it reflects the fact that it's almost constantly two separate conversations about this coach, about this program, about everything around the Ohio State Buckeyes. There's the what are you going to do? And then there's the are you going to beat Michigan? And yes, they're related, but no, they're not the same thing. And that the 23-point gap, I think, is appropriate.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, but Ryan Day himself is saying on this podcast with Chris Holtman, like, I kind of have something to prove. Like, I didn't have Ohio State ready to play that game the best way last season. He didn't really. I did find it more of I did find that it was more addressing 2022 than 2021. I wonder if they look back at 2021 and see those two games very drastically different because of what Michigan was in those 2 years. But he's definitely saying I didn't have it together for that 2022 game. I have to show something different in 2023, and that's what he's talking about. Like there are lessons there that he hopes to carry forward, and I'm curious if we'll see elements of it in the 11 weeks leading up to that, because some of it is philosophical, some of it is um, will we see it on defense? I guess maybe specifically, and what influence can his mindset change have on the rest of that roster?
So let's answer the first question that was asked as our final thing here on this Buckeye Talk. And again, it started off with Will from the 419 about the evolution of Ryan Day. And the last part of that question, Nathan, was what do you think the final evolution of Ryan Day as a head coach will look like? And so, first of all, I think we would both say we don't think it's this year. So we just had a 90-minute conversation about faith in Ryan Day right now. So now let's jump ahead. Whenever fully formed, fully fledged Ryan Day is locked in, how would you describe what you think the final evolution of Ryan Day will look like?
Like a wise old Ryan Day, what will that look like? I and it's hard because you look for comps, and there are some things about him that are a little bit unique. Um, Obviously, from his background and everything, you've got Chip Kelly sitting there, but he and Chip Kelly are not twins by any means. He's built a little bit differently. Certainly, he's built differently than Urban Meyer. Certainly, he's built differently than Woody Hayes and Jim Tressel, just from background and things like that. Um, I guess some of the things that I guess what I hope to see is I think you're already seeing again the the taking the more the CEO approach, um, and just following that through to I guess its natural progression, to where more things are delegated and to where you are the cultural center of your program and you are still the intellectual center of your program, but where you have completely delegated that out to high functioning people that you've trusted. I think that is maybe the most essential thing. And then on top of that is that next step, and he's already started taking it, but that next step towards trusting yourself outside your comfort zone in making major decisions about who those people are going to be. Because he, in this podcast was talking about, people are still the most important thing and etc. And I think it can be easy sometimes to shrink back and rely on the people that you personally trust the most already, emotionally or whatever, because they're closest to you. But the Jim Knowles example is going to have to be, I think, replicated successfully in the future, about how this program is going to sustain an elite level.
I do think the guy that comes to mind for me is Andy Reid in the NFL.
That's a good one. Yeah, that's
And
a good one.
I I actually covered Andy Reid in his time early in Philadelphia. And they were a very good team that couldn't get past the NFC Championship game. They lost in 3 straight NFC Championship games. And then they finally got over the top and they got to a Super Bowl. It's the only Super Bowl I ever covered, that Eagles Patriots Super Bowl
Yep.
in Jacksonville. And that idea, and then like what Andy Reid has become since then. So they got to that Super Bowl, and then it kind of fell off a little bit in Philly, but they were still good. And then he left, and then they got this thing going in Kansas City. And so the part of it that I think is familiar is Andy Reid is like an offensive guru. Everybody acknowledges that. He has the headset on, he has the play sheet, but Doug Peterson was a play caller and offensive coordinator for him. Um, Matt Nagy was, Eric Bieniemy was, right? He empowered those guys, but Andy Reid was always right there. They obviously elevated when he had Donovan McNabb and now he has Patrick Mahomes. That's when they elevate the most. But, they lost Tyreek Hill and they kind of plugged in more guys into the way they do things, like Travis Kelce's special. And it's different in the NFL because you get one Patrick Mahomes, you get one Travis Kelce, you get one Donovan McNabb, you're set, right? Ryan Day's got to find a new guy all the time. But there's and I don't know that anybody's like, oh, the Chiefs culture, like the way you would about the Miami Heat culture or the Bill Belichick culture, but also they just play offense at a really high level. Of course, Mahomes is the key to it all, but Andy Reid's kind of just doing his thing and he just like lets guys succeed. right? And so I think like that Ryan Day could reach that point where there's a vibe. I don't know if he's going to wear Hawaiian shirts, but there's a vibe. There's an offensive structure that he's intimately involved in, but he might have people who are the offensive coordinator, right? And they kind of just like do their thing, and like everybody knows what that is. And it's not as much of like a constant culture conversation, but Andy Reid's been doing it for 24 years now, 14 in Philly and 10 in Kansas City. It's remarkable. And I don't know if you tried to get someone who's not like a professional NFL person, right? Like a football fan. It's like, Andy Reid's good, but it's like, describe the Kansas City Chiefs culture for me. I don't even know if you could do it, except you'd be like, I don't know, they score a lot of points and they constantly win. And I do think Ryan Day is maybe a little more culture invested than that. And Andy Reid's had some things with the culture that haven't been so great. I do think Ryan Day is a good culture coach. But like that, I think it could be that, where maybe like Ryan Day's not, I don't know if Andy Reid's writing leadership books. Maybe he is, but it's not the same thing as Belichick. But it's a whole lot of winning, man. And there's an
Yeah.
offensive style that defines what they do as much as anything. And I think that, as much as college is different than the NFL, I think like a version of that as the final evolution of Ryan Day as like a sustainable thing. I don't think that's out of reach. And then like you create an offensive system where guys want to come play. And so, yeah, if you get a Mahomes, if you get a CJ Stroud, maybe you elevate even higher. But in general, you're always going to have good guys because what you do puts people in position to succeed.
No, I think it's a good comparison. Like I said, I was struggling to find a comp. It'd be like if Andy Reid was really into tennis instead of the more sedentary things Andy Reid has apparently been into.
Yeah, right. No, if Ryan Day like adds like a good like 140 pounds and gets a walrus mustache, I'm going to have some real questions. But yeah, tennis
Weren't
racket and a beard instead, and you're good to go.
weren't you a high school tennis player?
I was.
Have you not approached
Yeah.
Ryan Day about a one-on-one?
Let me tell you. Let's do this. Okay. Let's do this, and I'll tell you why I haven't. I played
I
tennis
know
with
why you
with
haven't.
Bill Rabinowitz.
I know. Why you haven't. Yeah.
I played with Bill Rabinowitz once, who is 10 years older than me. And if anyone knows Bill Rabinowitz, longtime Dispatch Ohio State reporter, he's a fine fella. I don't know. He wasn't a college football quarterback. He's just Bill Rabinowitz. Bill Rabinowitz beat the snot out of me. And it's like, well, I can't hang with him. And so it's like, okay, hey, Ryan Day, like Ryan Day, record setting high school quarterback. You want to play tennis? I can't pass the Rabinowitz level. I can't get to the Day level. So I'm out. Sorry.
That's fair, I think.
I'm
Like
out if I
Ryan
do
Day,
regret it.
you've
Okay.
recognized your shortcoming and you're addressing it by not going anywhere near him.
Oh, I was trying to discuss with my wife the other night the difference between ego and arrogance, and that arrogance is part of ego, but it's not the same thing because ego brings in that other side. That when you have an ego, you're arrogant, but then you're also like, I don't know, am I good enough? What do people think of me? Right. So that's the whole thing of ego. Arrogance is just arrogance. So
Right.
I am arrogant, but I am much more defined by my ego, which when you are arrogant, but you also know your faults and you fear your faults and you wonder if everybody else sees your faults, you then avoid them, which is what any egomaniac does. It's like, well, why would I even attempt to do that? Because I'm just going to embarrass myself, which would be a blow to my ego.
Yeah, I think ego can't be satisfied the way arrogance can. Arrogance is just something you can sort of declare. Ego is something you have to ultimately back up.
Yeah. Or avoid. Okay. Thanks to you guys for
Right.
making Buckeye Talk part of your week. We have a constant flow of podcasts coming your way. We hope this was valuable. The offseason is a good time to do this. And we all know that this is a big year for the coach and the program. So stick with our coverage at cleveland.com/OSU, on the text at 614-350-3315. And of course, at Buckeye Talk, which we know you guys are subscribed to. For now, for Nathan Baird, I'm Doug Maurice, and that was Buckeye Talk.